The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late October, the kind of day where the light goes flat by 3 o'clock and the wind carries the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. I was in the middle of a site visit for a drainage project in Kenosha County when my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I didn't recognize the number at first. I almost let it go to voicemail. "Mr. Sutter," the man said. His name was Eddie, and he had the voice of someone who had spent a lot of years outdoors. He was the electrician my cousin had referred me to, the one I'd hired to rewire the old farmhouse my mother had left behind. "I found something up here in the attic, something you're going to want to see." He paused. "I'd feel better if you came out before I touch anything else." I asked him what he meant. "Just come out," he said. "I'll show you when you get here." My mother had been gone for 4 months. She passed in June, a Tuesday evening, in the same hospital where she'd had her hip replaced 8 years before. She was 71. Her doctor said it was sepsis, which had moved faster than they expected, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like an explanation but doesn't actually explain anything. She had gone in for what should have been a routine procedure, a small surgery to address something that had been giving her trouble for years, and she had not come back out. That was the whole of it, as far as I could make sense of it. The farmhouse was in Walworth County, about 2 hours from where I lived in Evanston. It was the house my grandparents had built in the early 1950s, wide frame, wide porch, the kind of place that had been repaired so many times in so many ways that the repairs themselves had become part of the structure. My mother had inherited it when my grandmother passed and had lived there alone since my parents' divorce, which was the winter I turned 14. That was 26 years ago. My older brother Jeff had moved to Phoenix the year he finished college and hadn't been back more than twice. The house, the land, all of it had fallen to me to manage from a distance, which I had done poorly and with guilt for the better part of a decade. I drove out that afternoon. The corn in the fields along Route 11 had already been cut, and the rows of bare stalks ran flat and brown in every direction. I had been to the farmhouse twice since the funeral, both times to deal with paperwork and basic maintenance, and both times I had left feeling like I had only managed to move the surface of things. The house still felt like hers. Her rain boots were still beside the back door. Her reading glasses were still on the kitchen table. Eddie's van was in the driveway when I pulled in. He was waiting on the porch steps, which I understood later was not coincidental. He was a compact, deliberate man, the kind who didn't use extra words, and he shook my hand and said he'd show me rather than explain it. We went up the narrow staircase to the second floor and then through the door at the end of the hall that led to the attic stairs. The attic in that house had always been a storage space for things that didn't have anywhere else to be: old furniture, boxes of Christmas decorations, a rocking horse that had been my mother's, a metal shelving unit full of mason jars. The rewiring job had required Eddie to move some of that to reach the junction boxes along the north wall. He had shifted a stack of boxes and an old chest freezer that wasn't plugged in, and behind those, against the wall where the roof sloped down, there was a section of paneling that didn't match the rest. The wood was a slightly different color, a tone or two lighter, and the seam along the left edge was too clean. Eddie had seen it because he was looking for things behind walls, which is the kind of detail that only matters when you find something. "I noticed it where you note running the new line," he said, stepping back. "I didn't push on it or anything. That's not my business." The panel swung inward when I pressed it. It was hinged on the right side, and the hinge was tight, the kind of tight that comes from years of not being used. Behind it was a shallow space, maybe 18 inches deep, running about 4 feet along the wall between 2 studs. It was insulated on the back with old fiberglass batting, and against that batting, sitting on a piece of plywood someone had set across the studs as a shelf, there were 3 things: a metal lockbox, gray, the size of a large hardcover book with a combination lock on the front; a plastic bag, the kind you seal by pressing the sides together, containing what looked like photographs; and a business-size envelope with my name written on the front. My name in my mother's handwriting. Not a label. not a printed address. Her handwriting. The slightly looping cursive she used when she was writing something she meant for someone to read carefully. Eddie said, "I'll be downstairs," and he left me alone up there. The envelope first. I sat on the edge of the old chest freezer and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. My mother's handwriting, blue ballpoint, 3 pages front and back. I will not reproduce all of it here. It was a letter that had clearly been written over time, not in one sitting, the way you can tell when the pen pressure changes or the handwriting tightens toward the end of a paragraph. She had written it to me specifically. She started by saying that she hoped I never had to read it, which is the kind of sentence that tells you she knew she probably would. She wrote about my father. My parents had been divorced for 26 years. My father, whose name was Clarence, had remarried within 2 years of the divorce, a woman named Pam, who I had met a handful of times at family occasions and found neither warm nor unkind, simply someone who existed in the portion of my father's life that I was not part of. He had retired from his job as a regional manager for a commercial flooring distributor and was living in Scottsdale. We spoke 3 or 4 times a year. I knew him the way you know a person you are obligated to, but have no real fluency with, a language you studied once and never practiced. My mother's letter told me that in the final 18 months of their marriage, my father had moved approximately $160,000 out of their joint savings accounts and into an account she had not known existed. She had discovered this after the divorce, when she was trying to understand why the settlement had been so much smaller than she expected. By then, the money had been in the other account long enough that it was difficult to establish what had happened and when. Her attorney at the time had told her the documentation was insufficient to pursue, that the cost of litigation would likely exceed any recovery, and that she should move forward. She had moved forward. She had moved forward. She had taken the farmhouse as part of the settlement and had lived there for 26 years. She had worked as an office manager for a veterinary practice in Elkhorn. She had kept a garden. She had driven the same Subaru for 11 years. She had not remarried. She had not, as far as I knew, been particularly unhappy, which is a different thing from being happy. What she had done, quietly and without ever telling me, was spend the better part of a decade documenting what had been done. The lockbox combination was her mother's birthday, which she had written at the bottom of the letter. Inside the lockbox, there were 3 folders labeled in her handwriting. The first folder contained copies of bank statements, transfer records, and what appeared to be account opening documents she had obtained from the bank years later, through a combination of formal records requests and, according to her notes, the help of a woman she'd known at the bank who had since retired. The documentation showed the account, showed the transfers, showed the timing. My father had started moving money 8 months before he told her he wanted a divorce. The second folder was thinner. It contained a single printed document, a property deed, and a set of tax records covering several years. I did not understand what I was looking at immediately. I had to read the notes my mother had clipped to the front, written in the same careful blue ballpoint. What she had found, through the county assessor's records, which are public, was that my father had purchased a condominium in Scottsdale, Arizona, 4 months before the divorce was final. The condo was in his name and Pam's name jointly. He had listed the purchase price as $87,000. The tax records my mother had found suggested the actual value at the time of purchase was closer to $140,000. She had noted in her careful way that she could not prove the discrepancy indicated anything, only that it was consistent with a pattern she had observed. The third folder contained something different. It was not about my father. It contained documents about the veterinary practice where she had worked, the one in Elkhorn, and specifically about the owner, a man she referred to only in her notes as the doctor, though I knew his name from the years she had worked there. The folder contained copies of billing records, insurance claim forms, and a handwritten log she had kept over several years. Her notes explained what she had observed: a pattern of billing insurance companies for services that had not been provided, or billing at a level higher than the services that had been provided. The amounts were not enormous individually, but in aggregate, over the years she had documented, they were substantial. She had reported it, she wrote, to the State Veterinary Licensing Board 3 years before she died. She had received an acknowledgment letter. She had not received any further communication that she was aware of. She wrote that she was not sure she had done the right thing by not doing more. She wrote that she was not a person who knew how to make noise. She wrote that she had never in her life felt like the kind of person whose complaint would be taken seriously by the people who were supposed to take complaints seriously. She wrote that she was sorry if that was a disappointment to me. I sat in that attic for a long time. The insulation in the walls of the farmhouse was not good, and I could hear the wind moving around the eaves, the particular sound that old farmhouses make in October when the temperature drops and the wood contracts. The photographs in the plastic bag were not evidence of anything. They were photographs of my parents from before I was born, from the early years of their marriage, the kind of pictures that feel strange to look at because they show people you recognize in a time before they were themselves. My parents at what looked like a county fair. My parents in front of a car I didn't recognize. My mother looking sideways at the camera with an expression I had never seen on her face in my adult life. Something easy and open that I didn't have a word for. She had kept them. She had kept them in the same locked box, behind the same hidden panel, with all of it. I don't know what to make of that, even now. I've stopped trying to make it mean a single thing. Eddie finished the wiring job over the next 2 days, and I stayed at the farmhouse that weekend. I didn't sleep well. I walked through the rooms at night when I couldn't sleep, the way I had as a kid, the way the farmhouse always felt different at night, smaller and larger at the same time. I called Jeff in Phoenix that Saturday morning. He answered after 3 rings, and I could hear his kids in the background, the particular chaos of a Saturday morning with young children. I told him I had found something at the house and that I needed to talk to him. He asked if it was something that needed to talk to him. He asked if it was something that needed to be handled right away. I said I didn't think so, not immediately. He said he'd call me back that evening, and he did, and I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "How long do you think she'd been putting that together?" I told him I thought it had been years, a decade, maybe more. He said, "She never said anything to you?" I told him no. He was quiet again. Then he said something I've thought about since. He said she was protecting us from being angry. She didn't want us carrying it. I think he was right. I think that was exactly what she was doing. And I think the reason she left the box was that she had decided at some point that she was done carrying it alone, that she wanted someone else to know. Not to necessarily do anything, just to know. I found an attorney in Milwaukee who handled civil financial litigation, a woman named, I'll call her my attorney, because the details of what followed are still partially unresolved, and I've been advised to be careful. She reviewed everything in the first folder over the course of a week and came back to me with an opinion that was more optimistic than I expected. She said the documentation was unusually thorough for a case this old. She said my mother had done work that attorneys charge significant fees to do. The divorce had been final for more than 2 decades, which created real legal complications. The statute of limitations on most civil fraud claims in Wisconsin had long expired, but my attorney identified a narrower claim related to the dissipation of marital assets and found a case precedent she thought was worth pursuing. She was careful to set my expectations. She said this was not the kind of thing that would move quickly or resolve cleanly. It has not. The process has been going for 11 months as of the time I am writing this. There have been filings and responses and a deposition that I drove to Chicago for and sat through for 4 hours. My father's attorney, my father has an attorney, sent a letter in the spring indicating that my father was prepared to discuss a resolution. That conversation is ongoing. I have spoken to my father twice during this period, both times briefly and about logistics. The conversations have been strange in the way that all conversations are strange when you are in the middle of something legal with someone you share blood with. I do not hate him. I'm not sure what I feel exactly. I feel something more like the particular sadness of understanding a person better than you wanted to. The veterinary licensing board matter moved differently. I contacted them directly after speaking with my attorney and provided copies of what my mother had documented, along with a letter explaining the circumstances. 3 months later, I received a letter informing me that an investigation had been opened. That's all I know. My attorney says that licensing investigations can take years and that outcomes are not always what you hope for, and that hoping for a specific outcome is not the most useful use of energy. I went back to the farmhouse in July to deal with more of the contents. Jeff had flown in for the weekend, which had not happened in a very long time, and we worked through the rooms together, the way you do when you're clearing a house, making decisions that feel too small for how large they actually are. We kept the rocking horse. We kept the mason jars because Jeff's wife preserves things and will use them. We kept the reading glasses, which neither of us could explain. On the last evening, after dinner, Jeff and I sat on the porch the way we hadn't since we were children, with the fields dark in every direction and the sound of insects in the grass. Jeff had found the photographs by then, the ones from before we were born. He'd been looking at them while I made dinner. He had the bag in his hands when he came out to the porch. He said, "I didn't know she looked like that." I said I didn't either. We sat with that for a while. The panel in the attic is still there. I asked Eddie, when he finished the wiring, to leave it as it was. He asked if I wanted him to do anything to secure it, and I said no. It's just a space behind a wall now, an empty space. But I find I can't make myself seal it up. It feels wrong to do that, in a way I can't entirely articulate. The farmhouse is listed for sale. We had an offer in September that fell through when the buyers couldn't get financing, and we have another showing scheduled for next month. I go out there when I can, which is not often enough. The rain boots are still beside the back door. I keep meaning to do something with them, and I keep not doing it. My mother was not a loud person. She was not someone who filled a room or made demands or told you what she was thinking unless you asked, and sometimes not even then. I spent a significant portion of my adult life feeling a low-level guilt about not calling more, not visiting more, not doing more to make sure she was all right out there in that house by herself in the winters. I think I assumed she was fine, because she never told me otherwise. I understand now that those are not the same thing. What she left in that box was not a burden. That's what I keep coming back to. It would have been easy for it to feel like one. Easy to feel like she had handed me something heavy and then stepped out of reach. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels more like something a person does when they trust you, when they have decided, after a long time of carrying something alone, that you are the right person to know. Not necessarily to fix, just to know. I am not sure I am handling all of it the way she would have wanted. I've made decisions she might have disagreed with and held back in places where she might have pushed forward. I drove out to the cemetery in Walworth on a Sunday in early September by myself, in the morning before the day got busy. The grass was still damp, and the light was thin the way September light gets in southern Wisconsin, where the angle is already starting to change. I stood there for a while. I didn't know what to say. Eventually, I said what I actually meant, which was just that I had found it, that I was trying to do right by it, that I was sorry it had taken her 26 years to have someone to hand it to. The wind moved through the trees along the cemetery fence, the old oaks that have been there longer than anyone alive can account for. A truck went by on the county road. I drove back toward the farmhouse. There were geese in one of the fields along the way, maybe 40 or 50 of them, moving slowly across the cut rows in the gray morning light, and I pulled over for a minute and watched them. My mother used to do that. Pull over for things. She thought it was worth the time to stop and look. She was right about that. She was right about more than I understood while she was here to tell me. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately, not in any abstract way, just in the plain ordinary way a person thinks about it when they're sitting with the consequences of decisions made long before they were old enough to have any say in the matter. My father made a choice. He made it quietly, over a period of months, moving money in amounts small enough not to draw attention. And when he was done, he walked away from a marriage with more than he was entitled to and less than he seemed to understand he was leaving behind. What he left behind was not just the money. It was a woman who spent the next 2.5 decades living carefully, driving the same car for 11 years, working a job that suited her without ever quite being enough, and doing all of that without complaint and without asking anyone for anything. The money my father took didn't disappear. It just became something else. It became the gap between the life my mother had and the life she might have had, and she lived in that gap every day and never once named it out loud to me. That's the part I keep returning to. Not the fraud, not the legal process, not even the documents she spent years assembling in that farmhouse attic. What I keep returning to is the discipline it takes to carry something that heavy and not let it make you bitter. My mother was not a bitter person. She was private and sometimes distant, and she didn't say I love you easily, but she was not bitter. She had every reason to be, and she chose every day not to be. That's not nothing. That's actually one of the hardest things a person can do, and I didn't fully understand she was doing it until she was gone. What she did with her grief and her anger was turn it into something useful. She documented. She filed records requests. She kept logs. She wrote things down in her careful handwriting and she sealed them up, and she trusted that the right person would eventually find them and know what to do. That's a kind of intelligence I didn't fully appreciate while she was alive. The intelligence of someone who understands that they may not be the one to see a thing through to its conclusion, but who does the work anyway, because the work matters regardless of the outcome. I think about my own life when I think about that. The things I've started and abandoned because I couldn't see how they would end. The times I've decided that something wasn't worth pursuing because the cost was too high or the outcome too uncertain. My mother pursued something for a decade with no guarantee of resolution and no one to tell her she was doing the right thing. She just kept going. That's not luck or personality. That's a decision made repeatedly over years to keep doing the right thing even when it's inconvenient and invisible and possibly pointless. Jeff said she didn't tell us because she didn't want us angry on her behalf. I believe that. But I also think she didn't tell us because she hadn't finished yet. She was still working. She didn't want to hand us something incomplete. She finished it. She handed it to me when she was ready. I don't know if I've handled it the way she would have wanted. I've tried to be careful and patient and honest, which is what I think she was asking for. The legal process is slow, and the outcome is uncertain, and some of what she documented may never result in anything visible or satisfying. But she knew that going in. She wrote it in the letter, that she wasn't sure she was the right person to see it through, but that maybe I was. I hope she was right. I'm trying to be the person she thought I was when she wrote that.